Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podblog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Training and Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Welcome again to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, a SAS podcast. I'm especially excited to welcome you to this week's episode because it kicks off the first of a four-part series, a series that really is the reason I started this podcast. Several years ago, I was asked to present at Hamilton University in New York on trauma-informed interview principles and the neuroscience of trauma to a large multidisciplinary audience comprised of law enforcement, victim advocates, mental health workers, and Title IX administrators and staff. It was a 4-hour morning presentation. That afternoon, there was a panel of 4 young women who'd been asked to share their own stories of being raped while enrolled as students at various campuses in New York State. These 4 women, Mac McDonald, Jennifer Jones, Ellie Freeman, and Samantha McCoy, were brave and courageous enough to say yes to being on this panel. They participated for the sake of educating the audience on how not to treat victims of sexual assault. Their stories were hard to hear, yet even more difficult was the realization that when they had reported their rapes, each were treated with shame, disbelief, and blame for their own rapes. The impact in that room that afternoon was palpable. Afterwards, Mac, Jennifer, Ellie, and Samantha came up to me and asked if I was teaching the trauma-informed principles and the neuroscience of trauma to victims and survivors. When I told them that I hadn't, they were emphatic that I start doing so, and they all suggested that I start a podcast to get this information out and available to all victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. So I asked them if they would be willing to participate as guests on my show if I were to do this. Each of them, again, said yes. And now, years later, each of them have fulfilled their promise to being a guest on my show. Truly, it is an honor and a privilege to start this 4-part series today. Today, we'll hear from Mac McDonald. Mac is a strong and ferocious voice for justice for victims, especially fighting for better informed, empathic, and educated Title IX coordinators and investigators. She has an amazing attitude toward helping victims become survivors. Listen to Mac's story of strength and determination, and then help spread this episode to everyone you know, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Here's Mac.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's just a pleasure to have you here because you have agreed to talk about your sex assault story. And that's what this platform is all about, is giving victims/survivors an opportunity to tell their story if they want to. And you've done that in the past. And I know it's helped people in the audience at that panel, but I know that it's also going to reach lots of victims and survivors who need to hear your story. And I appreciate your willingness to do that. So, Mac, I'll just start out with the question, what are you able to tell us about your experience?
So I remember it was November 11th of 2012. I was with one of my friends in my dorm room at college. I was going to a community college at the time, and I'm going to call them out because the way I was treated by them. It was Monroe Community College in Rochester, New York. I was hanging out with my friend, and he asked me if I want to go to another friend's dorm room. So I was like, absolutely sure, because we were mutual friends with this person, and I trusted this person, and I knew everybody in that dorm. So it was like, okay, let's go. And when I got there was this other man there that I had never met before. I sat down and we were all just talking about sports, and we were all just hanging out. And this other man, I'll call him A, he asked me to go in the back because he wanted to show me a snow globe. So I was like, okay, absolutely, sure. He brought me in the back, and at MCC there was this shelf, like this place that we could do makeup or like get ready. And it was like indented in the wall. So like you could like sit, and he had me sit up there. And he started making passes at me, and I was like, okay, this is fine. And when he made another pass and he was like, okay, this is fine. This is as much as I can handle. And then he would do it again. I was like, okay, this is as much as I can handle. And then he started asking me to have sex with him. And I said no, because at the time I was a virgin and I really didn't want to. And that's not how I anticipated losing my virginity, is to some random person I had met that night. And he also told me he didn't have a condom, and I was like, absolutely not. I'm not getting pregnant. I'm 19. I'm not doing this. This is absolutely a hard stop. No. And he kept asking me over and over again, and I felt afraid because he was blocking me in and I couldn't leave without pushing him off of me or getting physical with him. And I was afraid if I got physical with him, he would get violent with me. So I was afraid of doing anything physical to him to get him out of my way. And he kept asking me over and over again. I kept saying no, and I kept telling him I didn't want to and giving him reasons why I didn't want to. He kept on ignoring those. And eventually I said, okay, you can take my virginity, but that's it. So he brought me into the bathroom, and he first had me give him oral sex, and I told him I didn't want to do that anymore. And he grabbed my head and forced me to continue. And at that point, I was really, really uncomfortable. And then he tried to have sex with me, and he couldn't do it from the position he was in. So he had me lay on the floor. As soon as the rape started, I felt a sharp pain. And I said, stop, you're hurting me. And he said, no, not yet. And at that point, I just remember clenching my fists and looking at the door and dissociating and not really knowing what was going on. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like 3 hours. It was 5 minutes at most. And I said again, stop, you're hurting me. And I grabbed onto his shoulders and pushed him so he would get off of me. And he didn't completely get off of me. He pushed his body off of mine enough where I could scoop my body out from underneath him. And I sat up. He took that as okay, this is done. So he got up, got dressed, and left. At some point the light was turned on. I don't know if he turned on the light. I don't remember if I turned on the light, but the light was turned on, and I immediately saw a huge pool of blood underneath me, and I knew it was from me. And I was like, oh shit, what am I supposed to do? I started immediately looking around to see if I could find anything to clean this blood up off the floor, and I couldn't find anything. There was no toilet paper, there was no paper towels, there was no anything in that bathroom. So I started to freak out, and I was like, what am I gonna do? I can't just leave this blood on the floor. This is a biohazard. I know that this is not safe for me to just leave, but I didn't at the same time want to ask anybody for help because I didn't want them to know what had happened. I stood up off the floor, and I remember looking at myself in the mirror and seeing blood all over me and freaking out, being like holy shit, what just happened? So eventually I called out to my friend who was in the dorm room. I was like, hey, can you get me paper towels? I need paper towels. So he went to my dorm room and got paper towels. I remember cleaning myself off and getting the blood off of my hip from when I rolled over to get out from underneath him. I had blood on my hip, on my stomach, all over the side of my body. I remember cleaning that off and cleaning off in between my legs because there's blood there too. And the next thing I remember is just leaving this dorm room and going to my dorm room. I don't remember cleaning up the blood, but I know I did. I know that I did, but I don't remember exactly what I did to clean it up. I don't remember the paper towels, what I did with them, but I know I did. But the next thing I remember is being in my dorm room, and my roommate was there, and I told her I wasn't a virgin anymore. She said she didn't believe me, so I kind of left it at that and was like, okay, I'm just gonna go take a shower. So I went and I took a shower because I had blood all over me, and I just felt gross from just the fact that this all had happened, and I didn't process what had happened. I don't think I fully processed what happened until years after it had happened already. But I got a tweet from my friend that was there that I went with to this other person's dorm room. He said, y'all need Jesus, because he had come to the bathroom to see what was going on and heard whispering and walked away and thought that I was hooking up with this guy. And I went down to talk to him, and I kind of told him everything that happened. I did not mention the rape aspect of it. I didn't tell him that I was forced to do anything. I didn't tell him that I had said no because I was afraid of the repercussions of telling people that I was raped. So I didn't mention that part. I kind of just, like, left it kind of vague, like, yeah, something happened in the bathroom, but, like, you know, it's fine, it's good, whatever. And I kind of went on with my life after that, and I didn't really mention it to other people. People would talk about it, and I was like, oh yeah, like, lost my virginity in a bathroom, like, cool. Because I didn't want people to know that it was rape, so I just, like, completely left that part out to everybody I talked to. And they started to catch up with me very quickly. I started having panic attacks daily, and I stopped going to classes because the trauma had made me just want to, like, isolate myself in my dorm room, and I basically just lived inside of my room for the next few weeks until it was Christmas break. And I was a criminal justice major as well, and ended up not doing so well in my classes and having to switch my major because I was not doing well in my classes. And I kind of gave up on the idea of becoming a cop because of that. And that semester went by, and then the next semester I started to struggle with, like, substance issues because I started to try to numb myself. So I was drinking more often, and that continued on to the next year when I eventually returned to the dorms and, like, was drinking every day, every weekend. Eventually turned 21 so I could buy my own alcohol, and was self-injuring a lot because I was really, really hurt by what had happened, didn't really quite understand it, was having panic attacks and dissociating and things that I had never experienced before because I had PTSD but not know it yet. And I was really struggling in school, and my second semester of my sophomore year, I threatened suicide, and was got really intoxicated, and basically told my roommates not to worry about me because I was gonna kill myself, and they started freaking out. And that night I ended up in a psych ward, the first time I was in a psych ward, and I was told that I just had depression and anxiety, even though I had mentioned, like, I was having dissociation and daily panic attacks and all these other symptoms that didn't really match up with depression and anxiety. Eventually I ended up leaving the dorms and not living in the dorms anymore, and kind of ignoring my trauma for a couple years. And then I switched my major from criminal justice to American Sign Language, or, like, we didn't really have a major of ASL, but you could take all the classes and then eventually transfer to RIT, which is NTID, and become an ASL interpreter. And that was my goal for a while, and I wanted to become an interpreter because that's what all my friends were doing, and that's what I thought I wanted to do. So I switched my major and eventually met some really great people. And these people really helped me process everything that had happened. And they were the first people that I told that I was raped. And eventually I came to terms with it. And the way that I came to terms with it was I kept asking myself questions like, I said no, does that mean something? Like, I said no, that has to mean something. Like, if I was telling him to stop and telling him he was hurting me, like, what did that mean? Did that mean something? Did it mean that he sexually assaulted me? Like, I didn't quite process it. And then there was some YouTubers who were accused of sexual assault, and the conversation of consent came up. And that's when I fully was like, oh shit, like, that was not consent. I did not consent to what happened in that bathroom. And that was really, like, a shock to me because I had always been questioning, like, I said no, what does that mean? And then the conversation consent really put it into perspective for me and made me realize that I was actually sexually assaulted. And then I told my friends and eventually ended up going to the police. And when I went to the police, it was an okay experience, but it wasn't the best experience either. First I went to a Planned Parenthood and told them that I was sexually assaulted, and the people at the Planned Parenthood were really great. I ended up getting an advocate who was there with me the whole time while I was reporting, and told me my options and were like, if you end up going to the police, like, I'll be here for you the whole time. So we ended up calling the police, and I just remember the police officers walking into the room, and one was in uniform and one was at like plainclothes, and talking to them, and they're like, oh, okay, if we're going to take your report, we have to take you to the police station. You have to go to the police station. And having to walk out with those police officers, and all the people in the waiting room seeing these police officers escorting me out of the Planned Parenthood, and like freaking out, being like, they know something happened, like what are they thinking, because I'm walking out with this police officer, like this looks really sketchy. And it was pretty obvious because the cop was in uniform. So that was a little traumatizing, because I kind of want to keep it on the down low, and now everybody's seeing me walk out with this cop. So I ended up going to the police station and reporting, and one of the first things that the police officer did was have me sit down in front of a computer and look at a picture of my rapist and identify him as my rapist. And that kind of set me into a dissociative state. So I was basically dissociative the entire time I was at the police station. And they took my report, but when they took my report, they didn't do it correctly. But I was so out of it that I didn't catch the mistakes that the officer had made when she was writing the report. So there was some inconsistencies in my report versus what I was saying. But I was not in a state to correct her or to look at her and be like, I want to sit here for another hour while you rewrite the report and retell my story so you can fix it. Because honestly, I just wanted to leave because I was so out of it, and I needed to see somebody who I knew and knew me, who could get me out of the state that I was in. Like, I almost got in a car accident on the way to the police station because I was so dissociative. It was not a great experience. And before I left, I asked the police officer if my school was going to find out. And they said, oh yeah, we already told them, like, they already know. So I was like, okay, the school already was already told. So I was like, that's one less thing that I have to do, is going to the school and telling them that I was sexually assaulted on the campus, and having to talk about my story again because they're going to hear about it already. So I went back to school, and a week went by, and I heard nothing from the school. I heard nothing from anybody. And I was like, this is odd. So my ASL club was going to New York City because we were going to go see Spring Awakening. And I was really excited to go, but there's one song in Spring Awakening. If you know the show, you know what song I'm talking about. And it's basically about sexual assaults and some abuse. So I was like, I can't sit through that song because it's really triggering for me. So I talked to my ASL teacher and was like, can I leave during this song and come back after that song? Like, I really just would like an aisle seat so I can go and leave during the songs and come back afterwards because I know it's triggering. She said absolutely, and we talked more, and she was very disappointed that the school was not talking to me, like very, very concerned for me. And she wrote a report to the school asking them to contact me because of how concerned she was about my safety. And the school notified me. The school contacted me after that. And I ended up talking to somebody in Res Life, and they were asking me about living on campus, and I informed them that I didn't live on campus anymore. And they told me that they didn't want me to talk to very many people. They didn't want me to have to talk to a bunch of people and retell my story, so somebody would contact me. I waited, and nobody contacted me for a month. And I was like, I'm not waiting anymore. So I reached out to the Title IX coordinator and was given a date of January 5th. And I remember the date because it was my sister's birthday. And my sister is somebody very important in my life. So I was like, oh, okay, like, I'll do this on my sister's birthday. This is, like, a big thing. Like, what a way to celebrate my sister's birthday. Like, kind of doing it for her, because I was very nervous. And I went into the office, and the Title IX coordinator was horrible the whole time. She blamed me for my rape, basically, and was very demeaning and asked me questions like, was he a big man? If you were raped, why didn't you go to the hospital? Did you seriously tell nobody for 3 years that you raped, not even your best friend? And questions like that the whole time. Didn't take any notes, didn't do anything the whole time while I was there. I was not in the right state after I left. The only person in that room that was nice to me was the male security person. I forget what they're called. Public safety officer. The male public safety officer was extremely kind to me, checking in, making sure I was okay the whole time, and was making me laugh when appropriate. And the Title IX coordinator, who was a woman, was horrendous and blaming me the whole time. So I left and was like, fuck that, I'm not doing that again, basically. And I ended up going to a local rape crisis center because I knew that there was something wrong. I think at this point I was diagnosed with PTSD already, or was in the process of getting diagnosed with PTSD. I don't quite remember when I was was not diagnosed with PTSD yet, but I was reaching out for therapy because I knew something was wrong. But I was not diagnosed with PTSD yet. So when I went in, I was hooked up with a therapist who specifically deals with sexual assault. And I told her what had happened with the school, and she was like, oh, that is not okay at all. And I kind of knew that in my head because I had already watched a movie with Andrea Pino and Annie Clark. And it was their video about Title IX, their documentary about their Title IX complaint. And I was like, oh, like, is it going to be that kind of situation? Because I was very nervous about it getting to that point. I wasn't sure if that's really what I wanted. I didn't know if I wanted to file a Title IX complaint against the school. But I figured that probably was what was going to happen because I was very uncomfortable with how I was treated by the school. And she was like, well, we'll have somebody reach out to you. And the date that they gave me was February 6th or February. It was early February. I don't remember the exact date, like February 3rd, February 4th, something like that. And before that, my dad actually called me on the phone and said, hey, I got a letter from the school. They informed me that the investigation into your sexual assault or your case was closed. So the school ended up closing my rape investigation the same day that I met with them. So they didn't do any investigating into my rape at all. They closed the case as soon as they met with me. And that was that. That was what I was supposed to expect from the school. So I was like, nope. I ended up hiring an attorney because I was very unsatisfied with that as my result. I was like, that can't happen. What happens if I'm on campus, because I was still at the time a student at this school. What if I'm on campus and my rapist shows up? There's nothing to protect me. There's nothing that's gonna protect me from this man raping me, and he wasn't even a student at my school. He had never been a student at my school. Even the night he raped me, he stayed in the dorms for weeks after my rape, and he wasn't a student. So I had to walk the halls afraid that I was going to see this man, and he ended up showing up in my dorm room. Let me backtrack a little bit. So he showed up in my dorm room a week after my rape and was hanging out in my dorm room. I was so afraid of leaving my room that I stayed in my room for the whole time he was there. And when he left, I walked up to my roommate and was like, I don't want him in our room anymore. He makes me so uncomfortable. I don't want him here anymore. And basically crying to her, telling her I didn't want to see this man ever again in our dorm room. And she was like, I will make sure that happens. So I didn't have to see him again after that, luckily. And my roommate was very protective of me and made sure I never saw him again. But he wasn't a student at my school, and the school did nothing at this point to protect me. So the attorney reached out to the school and got in contact with the school's attorney and was sending things back and forth and basically got my educational records and got my statement, and the statement was the same statement that the police had taken. So they didn't even take my statement on their own. They just took the police statement and took it for their word and didn't do any investigation. So my attorney was like, that's not what's going to happen. She requested that my statement was changed in my educational records, and I gave my attorney my statement. She typed it out. We went through it together, and my educational record was changed at that point. And I ended up getting a no trespass order for my rapist at my school. Things I had to fight for, which was not given to me. It was really hard work that I had to do for myself to make sure that I was safe at school. But I didn't feel safe. I never have felt safe at that school again after what had happened. So I ended up dropping out of school and not finishing my education because of what had happened, the way the school treated me. I found out a couple months later, it was April 27th, I want to say, I found out that my school was now under investigation for a Title IX complaint, the Title IX complaint that I had, and I was freaking out because I didn't want people to know it was me. I didn't want people to find out that I had filed a Title IX complaint against the school. I didn't want my name out. I didn't want anybody knowing. At this point, I'm like, I don't care anymore because it's been years and I'm not at that school anymore and they deserve everything that comes to them. They're going to use that against me because they've used other things against me, which is insane to me, but I don't wish anything ill against the people at the school. I just want the school to be held accountable for how they treated me, and I want to make that clear because they want to use everything I say against me, but I wish nothing against anybody at the school. My attorney was wonderful and managed to get me things. And then the Title IX people reached out to me a couple months later and asked if I wanted an early complaint resolution. And I told them, sure, I'm willing to do that. The night before, I tweeted something, and that tweet was then used against me. I don't remember what I said, but it was something along the lines of, if I don't get what I want, then fuck the school, basically. And I don't think I was asking for unreasonable things either. I was basically just asking for the school to have people look out for the students in the dorm rooms, and for the Title IX coordinator to not be shitty at their job was basically it. And I can't really discuss a lot of the early complaint resolution because legally I'm not allowed to, but basically everything that I said beforehand was used against me in that. And so I said, I don't feel safe doing this. I don't feel comfortable doing this. I'm not doing this. This is over, basically, and shut it down. And the school has been under investigation by the Department of Education since then. They've reached out to me again, asking if I wanted an early complaint resolution. And I said no because of how it went down before. I said, this is whatever happens, happens. I don't care if they're found guilty of violating Title IX. I don't care if anything comes of it. What I want is for them to realize that they messed up with how they handled my assault. And I think that I did that by filing the complaint. And I hope that they realize that they can't treat survivors like the way that they treated me, because it caused more trauma and caused more pain on me and made my trauma even worse and made the school completely unsafe. And I don't have a degree because of it.
Mac, let me just start by saying I am so sorry for everything that you've gone through from the get-go with this story. It sounds horrendous. And I can see in your eyes and hear in your voice, this is still a really painful thing. And obviously that makes perfect sense as to why. Mm-hmm. I just am so sorry that things have evolved into what they've evolved into. And I agree with you. This just wasn't handled right from the beginning. It's trauma upon trauma. And I'm just sorry for what happened to you. I think you're extremely brave to sit here with me and talk about this the way you are and be so open about it. And you've given so much information and detail. I'm wondering if you're okay for me to ask a few questions about some of the things that you've discussed. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So let's go back, if we could, to the night this all started and help me understand how that fear kind of enveloped you. Tell me more about those feelings when this started.
So I think I've always had a fear of men, specifically a certain type of man. And this was not the first time that I've experienced trauma, sexual trauma. And unfortunately, I was sexually harassed in high school and sexually assaulted in high school as well. Different kind. The first one was I say just sexual harassment as if it's not traumatic. But to me, it's the least traumatic of the experiences. So I talk about it as if it's not a big deal, but it really was. And it lasted a really long time. And I don't want to minimize other people's trauma if they were sexually harassed, because it is a very traumatic experience. I was sexually harassed for 10 years by the same man. Eventually I cut him off. Every time he would get a new phone or get a new Facebook or get a new Instagram, he would reach out to me and send me unsolicited pictures and make sexual comments towards me. And the other one was forcible touching when I was 17. And that was another trauma in itself. It took me a week to come forward to my teacher because it happened in a criminal justice class. And my criminal justice teacher was amazing and handled it perfectly. Like, he immediately took me to the principal's office. It was like, I'm not taking no for an answer, basically. Not like in that way, but he was like, I don't want this to happen to you, and I don't want you to have to deal with this type of situation. He was, I guess what I'm trying to say is, he was very protective of me and wanted to make sure that I was safe. So he brought me to the principal's office to make sure that I was safe and had me tell my story to the principal. And the principal ultimately decided to call the police, and I got a a restraining order against that person, and he wasn't allowed to come back to criminal justice. So I think that those experiences had made it more difficult for me to trust men, and a specific type of man. I don't know what it is specifically. Like, I couldn't tell you what makes me fear men until I actually experience it. But I just get a vibe off of certain men that just, it gives me bad vibes, and I can't settle that down. And he was one of those type of men. I think it's, if I could somewhat describe it, because it's also not just like physical, it's also the attitude that they have. If I could describe like the appearance, it's mostly like big muscular men that I know are strong, because I'm afraid that they could physically hurt me in a sense. So that's the physical aspect, and then the demeanor is like just I don't know how to describe the demeanor, I guess, is what I can't really describe. But the fear is, he gave me that vibe when I was sitting on that counter. I just got the vibe that I was not safe, and I didn't know how at the time to advocate for myself because I had never been put in a position where I had to, and I've never been in a sexual situation before, so I didn't know how to handle it, and I didn't know what to do. If that answers your question.
It does. I'm impressed by how brave you are to talk about this and go back to those feelings. Are you able to talk a little bit about how it's making you feel to even talk about this? Are you feeling some of the same emotions and physical reactions that you had before?
A little bit. I'm a little dissociative, not gonna lie. Can kind of feel myself like not really here, but kind of. And that's kind of how it always is when I tell my story, is like I get dissociative. Not to the point right now where I'm not present, but it can get to that point. So if I stop responding, it's because I'm dissociating. So
Sure. Which is a common defense mechanism of the brain when our emotional center of our brain starts sensing danger and fear triggers. It's amazing to me that you've been able to talk about this experience, but that not only that you've done it so many times.
Mm-hmm.
Help me and the audience understand how it is that you're able to continue to talk about this and how it's helping, if at all, in describing what your experience was.
I think what helps me tell my story is knowing that it could potentially reach survivors and help a survivor feel less alone because they know that someone else has experienced it. And it doesn't even have to be a similar story, because I think every single survivor story is so different. I think that knowing that there's somebody out there who is speaking out, because sometimes as a survivor, you feel afraid to tell your own story because there might be different circumstances that prevent you from being able to tell your story, whether it be you're afraid that your abuser will find you, or you're still in that abusive relationship, or there's legal ramifications if you tell your story. There's so many things that prevent survivors from coming forward. I'm not in that position, and I feel very privileged that I am able to tell my story because I'm not in that situation, because I know how scary it is to be in that position. And privilege is not the right word, because I'm telling a story about an assault, but I feel very lucky that I'm not afraid of my rapist coming and finding me at this point in my life, because I did live in fear for a very long time that he would.
Yeah.
And he still very well could, but I have a lot of other people in my life that will protect me now.
That's good that you've got that kind of support system in place. I'm really happy to hear that. I think what you're doing is impressive, like I mentioned, and I think it's not only extremely brave, but helpful. And I think it makes me go back to the panel, and that morning's session before the panel was me describing some of the neuroscience behind what the brain does as a result of trauma and what's happening during the trauma. And I remember you and Ellie and Sam and Jennifer coming up to me afterwards and saying, you have got to start a podcast, and victims and survivors need to hear this information. So it's why we're here tonight talking about this and discussing it. It's impressive that you've mentioned that you want to help survivors and victims understand more. And I'm extremely happy that you're talking about this the way you are. Can we talk a little bit more then about that? The issues of the neuroscience behind the trauma, I want you to talk to us, if you can, about how you learned that a lot of what you're feeling, the dissociation you keep mentioning, is so common. Tell us about how you learned about that dissociative state and what it means for you to be in that place and how it is that you handle it.
So I was diagnosed with CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which means that I have more than one trauma associated with my PTSD. It's more traumas built up, whereas PTSD might be one like traumatic experience, and you could have more traumatic experiences, but with CPTSD you have like repeated traumas. And with CPTSD, one of the symptoms is dissociation. I'm not sure if with PTSD you dissociate. I'm unsure of that. I just know that when I was told I had CPTSD, that's what they told me. And when I get very anxious is when I can feel myself dissociating. When I get in a situation where my panic becomes too much, my body is like, hold on a second, we're going to take you out of the situation so you can stop panicking for a second, is how I interpret it. Because I notice like when I start to panic more is when I start to dissociate, or when I get like very anxious about a certain situation that I'm in, my body kind of essentially shuts down and kind of tries to take me out of that situation to protect me. And the way that I've learned how to handle it is a lot of therapy, honestly. I have some pretty great therapists that have really worked with me a lot on this. A lot of DBT therapy specifically, which is dialectical behavioral therapy, and that helps with learning how to ground yourself. And I've learned a lot of grounding skills, and recognizing what it feels like to dissociate for me, which I know the warning signs of dissociation for me. One of my big ones is I like touch my eyes a lot and rub my eyes, because one of my big things is my eyes start to feel weird. I like can kind of see my vision changing, so I rub my eyes to try to get my eyes to be normal again, because I want to be able to see, I want to be able to focus, but my eyes, like my vision is changing and my hearing is changing as well. Like I can hear things happening, but I can't make out the conversation. So if somebody's talking to me, I can recognize that somebody's talking to me, but I don't know what they're saying to me. So I can hear, it's basically just like mumbling or like background noise almost. And I kind of just stare at the person and they expect a response from me, but I can't make it out because I don't know what they're saying. And that's like, those are my two biggest warning signs that I'm dissociating. And that's the beginning stages, and as it gets worse, as I dissociate more, there's more, but those are my two big ones. And I oftentimes will take myself out of the situation that is triggering to me and causing me to dissociate, and I will look around the room and find there's doing the senses. I can't remember exactly. I think it's like 5 things that you hear, 2 things you can touch, or something like, it's something like that. I don't remember exactly what it is. I can't remember. I wish I did. But I'm sure if you look it up online, you can find it. That really helps me. And physically putting my feet on the floor and recognizing that I feel the ground beneath me really helps too, because when I'm dissociating and when I get worse, I feel like I'm floating. So if I recognize that my feet are on the floor, I can feel myself on the ground, and it helps bring me back down, or reminding myself where I am, because oftentimes there's 2 types of dissociation. If you have dissociation, there's derealization and depersonalization. Derealization is where you don't recognize like what's going on around you, and depersonalization is when you don't feel like yourself, like you're completely out of body. I suffer from both. I have both. But oftentimes it's derealization. And so if I remind myself, I'm currently in Rochester, New York, and I'm in my house, in my bedroom with my dog. My dog is behind me. And I'm on a Zoom, and those types of things really help bring me back into the moment so I can ground myself and come back into my body.
That is so helpful. I know our listeners are absorbing this, and that this is resonating with many of our listeners who may have experienced some of the things that you're experiencing and have experienced, but didn't know what it was and didn't know how to deal with it. So I appreciate that that realization on your part and your willingness to share this, because it's actually helping others. And that's what this whole platform is all about. Tell us a little bit more about the shame that was brought on, not only internally, talk a little bit about that, but also the external shame that even initially your roommate brought on to you when you told her what had happened.
I think the shame was with the idea that I had let myself get into this position and blaming myself for what had happened. And I feel like that's a thing a lot of survivors go through, is blaming themselves for what happened and feeling like, well, if I didn't do this and if I had done this differently, then this wouldn't have happened. And the shame of having to tell people, and there's a lot of victim blaming. A lot of people love to blame the survivor for what had happened to them and find a reason to blame them. Like, what were they wearing? Well, what were they drinking? Were they drunk? Were they doing drugs? Like, all these reasons to blame the survivor. So there's the shame of having to admit that this happened and not wanting to be blamed for it, because there's a way that somebody will always find a way to blame you for it, even though it's never the victim's fault. I just want to clarify that it's never the victim's fault. You did nothing wrong, and what happened to you is completely the perpetrator's fault. And that, I think, is the biggest thing that I went through, was not blaming myself and realizing that this is completely my rapist's fault, and he did this to me, and I have no reason to be ashamed or be afraid of telling people that this happened, because it's not anything on me and it's nothing against my character. That, I think, was the hard thing for me to come to terms with, and I think I'm still working on some of that. I don't think it's a process that completely is like, oh, I'm fine now. Like, it's a very linear process. It's something that I'm going to have to battle with my whole life. Yeah, that's not an uncommon thing for me to hear from survivors, is that it's a struggle constantly to try and rationalize and deal with that shame and self-blame and the guilt that you feel on yourself, when really, as you just said, it all belongs on the perpetrator. They know what they're doing. And obviously you were so clear in stating that you didn't want what was going on. I think even from the very get-go, the coercion and fear involved doesn't sound or look, in my mind's eye at all, like consent of any type. And so I'm really thankful that you recognize that. And I think it's great that we're talking about this, because other victims need to know this in getting to the survivor point. Tell us a little bit about your survivorship. How have you been able to move forward in spite of this? So I've met some really wonderful people. I've met a bunch of survivors who have really helped me. Obviously, I have Samantha and Ellie and Jennifer, and they, from the moment I met them, I was instantly, like, we bonded. I just remember we met actually, before we met you, we met in New York City, and that experience really bonded us. We all got on a train and went to New York City, and they sat together because I think that they had met before. They both got on the same train at like the same spot. So they were together and I was sitting in a different place, but we texted and I sent them a photo of myself so they could like see what I was wearing and like what I was looking like that day. And when we got to New York City, we actually went to we walked around New York City, and since I had been to New York City before, I was like the tour guide because they had never been. So we were walking around together. I was showing them Times Square. We were like just hanging out in New York City together, and it was such a wonderful experience. And then we got in a taxi and we went to Tarrytown. And by the time we had gotten to the hotel, we were all like really bonded, I guess. And we were talking, we were laughing, we were acting like had been friends forever. And they couldn't believe that we had just met that day. So it was really entertaining because we were all just very tired and very close instantly. And we were hanging out that night too. I remember Samantha and I were hanging out because we were like really nervous about the panel the next day that we were going to do. Which I don't know how much I can talk about that, but we did a panel together, and we were really nervous about it. And we had seen like some of the people who were going to be at that panel the next day come into the hotel because they were staying at the same hotel as we were, and we were like nervous instantly. So we were all like really bonded. And we've kept in touch. We've done, I think at this point, like 2 other things together, maybe even 3, I don't remember. And every single time we hang out, all of us, it's just such an experience, and I love them. And I am so grateful to have them in my life because they have really helped me through some really difficult times. And I know I can reach out to them with anything that I'm struggling with, and they will give me the support that that I need at the moment, and just give me the most encouragement to get me through it. And I appreciate them for that so much. Samantha actually did something in New York City a couple years ago, and I went to New York City and we just hung out for the weekend, just the 2 of us together. We walked around New York City together, and it was such a great experience. Like, we got so close when we were there because it was just the 2 of us and we didn't have anybody else there, so we were just walking around together and we had so much fun. It was like one of the best experiences. So like things like that have really helped me. I actually volunteer for a nonprofit organization now that helps survivors of sexual assault. It's called Warriors, and I love every single person who volunteers for them. Like, we all have gotten really close, and I love all of them as well. And they've also been a great support for me. Like, whenever I'm struggling, I can reach out to any of them and they will support me through whatever I'm going through. And just being able to talk about my experience and know that I'm changing one person. The thing that I love is when I go to these panels that I talk on, I am helping somebody who is not a survivor understand how to help a survivor better. And that could impact a survivor in the future, so they don't have to go through what I went through with the school, because that is something I never want anybody else to ever have to experience again. And if I could talk to that timeline coordinator again and be like, this is how you should talk to survivors, this is how you should deal with survivors, like, you are a timeline coordinator, you should know this stuff, like, you deal with survivors, so I don't know why you're talking to a survivor like this. If I could go back and like talk to her and tell her how to deal with survivors better, I would totally do that, because I never want her to talk to another survivor how she talked to me. I never want her to ask the question of, if you're bleeding, why don't you go to the hospital? Because that is such a personal question. Like, and her basically blaming me and being like, he must have been a big man to rape someone like you, and basically telling me point blank that she didn't believe me. It was horrible. So I don't want anyone to ever have to experience that again. So that's why I tell my story as well.
It's why I wanted you here. It's why I wanted you on this podcast, is because people need to hear those exact words. So thank you very much. I really want to have the opportunity to talk to you again, and maybe not just once, but several times again as a returning guest, because I think there's so much more we could delve into. You've touched on some great things, and I appreciate it. But I think also we could go into some of the things that we talked about in the panel that I was fortunate enough to be present for, but also some of the things that we've talked about in my training, which is the neuroscience of memory and the sensory perceptions that help us remember things that we struggle to remember, because it doesn't feel great to not be able to fill in some of the holes that trauma creates in our memory. But then also there are things that we would rather forget and can't. And I think it's important to explain to other survivors and victims the issues that maybe they're struggling with. And I think you can help with that. And I appreciate your willingness. So could we talk again in the not too distant future?
Absolutely.
I love that. Thank you so much, Mac, for your willingness to be here. This has been a great start of an ongoing series that we'll have with you. And so I appreciate your permission to do that and your being here. And I'm looking forward to staying in touch with you and talking to you again. So
absolutely.
Thanks, Mac. I'll be in touch.
That does it for another episode of SAS. Thanks for listening. Listen to a new episode each week. And please remember to subscribe, rate each episode, and spread the word about this important podcast, because we all know someone who's been affected by sexual assault or rape. Remember to start by believing, and let's all do our share to help bring justice to victims of rape and sexual assault. We'll talk to you next week.